Gentlemen, first of all, it's my role, I think, tonight to welcome our visiting speaker, our guest speaker, sorry, who's well known to everybody because he's the ONSEC of the Nautical Institute Southwest of England branch. Gordon Foote has been a dedicated man to the Nautical Institute, and he's here to speak not on meteorology, which some of you might have come to hear about, but to speak on his piece of academic work he did on maritime training. Sadly, Andrew Eccleston, who was to have spoken on meteorology, has had a sad incident at home. He lost his daughter a couple of days ago, who was walking a dog and got hit by a car, and he felt unable, quite rightly, not to come tonight. And so Gordon came in and said he would take this slot on, and so we thank you very much, Gordon, for that, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much.
You.
Thank you very much, Paul. And for those that have joined us online, both here face to face, it was at rather short notice, and the Nautical Institute Southwest branch has sent their condolences to Andrew and his family. That's on behalf of the committee, of course, and all the membership. Quite a sad event. So I've stepped in, and this is something I've put together because I originally had put a few slides together as part of my academic research. And this presentation was going to be originally provided at some point during this year, but I'd put it into January next year. But Andrew has volunteered once the new year starts to do his meteorology presentation. So basically we've rescheduled and swapped places. So without further ado, I'll introduce what this is about in case people are unaware. We usually put out a flyer and, of course, a bit of a blurb and a bio on the presenter. But as Paul has said, most people know me. I've presented here before, and with a short notice, there wasn't time to put anything else out. But suffice to say, this presentation is going to be quite short. I think it's going to be about 30 minutes. It gives ample time thereafter for a discussion, because I don't think there'll all be questions directed at me, but it's always good to have a healthy discussion around these events. And it's a presentation that's going to centre around the academic work that I did in 2022. And it had a title, Maritime Leadership in a Changing World, the Role of the Future Professional Mariner. And most of us will have recognised that title because it was the Nautical Institute Southwest branch that had the opportunity to play with the words and think what the Nautical Institute celebrations were going to be in 2021. So pre-pandemic and prior to these events, I'd put a lot of thought personally into where the maritime was going and what was happening. Amongst many things with sustainability, trying to get carbon neutral, alternative fuels, there was also mass and the autonomous world that we were moving towards. In fact, with the University of Plymouth, it must be 10 years ago, I came and visited them when they were doing a presentation on autonomy and getting the views of masters of vessels to see how, with autonomy coming in, how people within a control center or control room would be able to basically steer and navigate a vessel at sea. So those things have moved on and they're coming quite close to us. So there's the title. Just as a sort of background again, my research was thought out well before the pandemic, and I must have spent 2 or 3 years considering whether I was going to do it or not. The MLA College, where we're sat at the moment here, face to face, was an entity that, as a training provider or host for degrees, were providing me the opportunity to do my own research and name my research within their academic structure. So that was really good. And I had a chat with John Chudley before I started and said, this is what I'd like to do. This is where I want to go with it. It got the green light from MLA College here, and I moved on and started in the January intake of 22, finished in last Christmas. The process meant that the grading was then in March, and then because of the links with the University of Plymouth, the graduation was September, just gone, which, being at sea at the time, I couldn't attend. But there you go. There's a bit of history on that. I'm now going to share my screen And Richard, if you could let me know that that's been successful when it does launch correctly, that is. You should see a blue banner coming up now that I've shared.
Yeah, got it, Gordon.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a bit of a time lag where the clicking of the button, but I think we've got there now, and you should be in the mode for the slideshow. So maritime leadership in a changing world, the role of the professional mariner. And this is what I did in conjunction with MLA College with the University of Plymouth. I'm not going to read that fully. I'm going to leave that slide there for those that wish to read it themselves and talk over the top. But it's basically an executive summary or the introduction about what the research was. And it's quite evident there that with the United Kingdom and the British Isles, we're an island if we don't consider our maritime, because our history is rich in the maritime domain, of course. And as it says there, brings prosperity and not least security. And as you're reading that, then you'll get a flavour of where we're coming from with this research. It's all about the strategy and consideration, primarily of UK-centric, of course. So primarily about the cadets and the system that they go through. How in the UK that we manage that system that we currently have in place, how good it is, the pros and cons, or how bad it is, but also thinking of the wider maritime, the blue economy, and some of my background and history came into that as well as a flavour, and that's through my experience of having not come through the cadet route myself, but was Royal Navy originally, transferred into the project side of the merchant navy that's conducting offshore work, and thinking more about not only the technology that we use in the offshore environment, whether that's oil and gas or renewables or even in the environmental spheres, but also all the different disciplines and people that go into making up the teams that operate in our blue economy. And that's both within the UK waters and our domain here, but also internationally, of course. So I mentioned that I came from a Navy background. So yeah, a bit different. The first half of my career was spent under the water. So I'm glad to say now I'm getting some fresh air and I can clean and wash my clothes a lot more regularly and smell probably a lot better. And I'm now serving on top of the ocean. So I was an engineer by trade, so that's what I've taken to the offshore industry. So my experience when I was entering this research was thinking along the lines of how the Navy had a training pipeline, how they took young people, whether apprentices or straight from school, and the extent, the duration, and how in depth and the kind of training that they provided. And it wasn't just about the academics or the classroom work. I also considered about the buddy system, or the CDAD, as it was called there, and what we now call vocational training or on-the-job training. So that was something to consider as well, and how well or not that's done in the merchant navy. So this is the kind of I think you can see the full slide there. Some of the text, because it's larger, is not on the full screen. But some of the projects that I get involved with in the maritime now is obviously topside is where my domain is, where I live. But the vast majority of work that I do is within the water column and the subsea work, whether that's hydrographic survey or piling or installation of offshore assets subsea. So I think my experience allows me to not only appreciate the physical marine crew, those that are on DP2, DP3 vessels, that includes the engine room, of course, and those that are driving the vessel and keeping it there on position, but also the vast array of different specializations that are involved in the project work for operations such as this. So why do anything academic about it. And I think one of the things I picked up on, and that sort of slide or those comments were made by the MLA College when I first joined, was with regards critical analysis and thinking a lot deeper into problems. So modern problem solving requires us not to just Google or skim around the edges, but to really dig deep on this. And as part of a teamwork or as academic study anyway, it's invariably, it's never a single person that does it, but a combined effort, usually by practitioners or specialists within that field. And the whole aim of it is to put another brick in the wall, as it says there, another brick, building on the knowledge, if you like. So there's a baseline of knowledge. How do we add another brick to this wall with another nugget of something that not only I have learned, but something for industry to take on board, and for other academics to build upon, should they so wish. So that's usually the aim of academia. And I also got to say that where I didn't go to university when I left school, I was brought up in the wrong end of the council estate, was a bit of a toe rag, and the Navy straightened me out and gave me a trade. So later in life, I found academia, and I was always, prior to starting any research or academic work like that, was always critical myself, I think, of periods of where people would write these dissertations and theses, and then they'd be in leather-bound books and they'd be stuck in a dusty library somewhere that nobody ever looked at again. So when I decided to venture it into this, which was well out of my comfort zone and something I hadn't done before, I wanted to do it right. I wanted to do it to the best of my ability, but I didn't want it to remain dusty on a shelf. Throughout my academic work, I've shared with interested parties, other associations, institutes, and people that are studying within this field. And hopefully that's how modern academia is now progressing, where we're sharing this information and knowledge. And institutes like RENA, IMRS, and of course the Nautical Institute are all about sharing that knowledge and understanding with others. So that's a part of why I did it. So the research problem was maritime operations of the future that are subject to ongoing technological advances, and how mariners train and how it shapes their ability to cope with future challenges would be the utmost importance. So that's the way I looked at it as a research problem. And questions that came up straight away: is the current UK strategy for maritime training fit for the challenges and sufficient to support future maritime operations? And what does this training consist of? Will the future maritime professional be ready to meet these challenges? So they were the initial research questions, and I chose a different methodology to start with, but how good the supervision was with the MLA College during my academic research was, I was a couple of months into it when it was put to me that maybe a different methodology, one that I quite honestly I'd not heard of before, but one that I took on board and used that. And the way the Delphi methodology works, and I used a 2 cycles 4 phase, was basically asking key questions. So in a lot of research where you've got a body of people that you select and you put a quiz or a survey and you start asking people questions, I went about it well in advance and asked significant people that were in the Merchant Navy Training Board, Trinity House, Honourable Company of Master Mariners, some Nautical Institute, and I also added in a couple of non-UK Master Mariners and others that had a very good reputation internationally within the maritime, to see how that blend of answers will come about with the questions that I was going to pose. And I'll touch on it on another slide, but basically there was 35 were invited to take part in my research as in practitioners and mariners, and 32 were able to complete. There's always a reason why some can't, and it's usually through their work, if they've signed non-disclosure agreements or they're in a very political position where even with the promise of being anonymous throughout, that they're reluctant to. But suffice to say, 32 out of 35 was good, and the 32 that completed, I was forever grateful for. This kind of research obviously doesn't ever take place without a big team effort and those voluntarily giving their time. And the Delphi methodology was basically to ask some key questions based on some assumptions or something from my knowledge or background, and receive the feedback from those participants, and then onto the first round where where I distributed the survey and we analysed the results. So everyone answers the questions, but then the full set of answers that everyone has given is then redistributed back to all those participants. So unlike blind questionnaires or just sending a survey where they just tick boxes or said out of A, B, C, D, which do you think is best, they to some degree had some free text and could say what they wished, but they all did it on the understanding that eventually they would see everybody else's responses as well. So although anonymity was maintained throughout, it was the case that without answers or knowing anyone else's rank, nationality, age, gender, or where they were within the maritime, they knew that everyone would see their responses. And from that feedback, it's then indicative that some responses, or the majority, if you like, as a democracy, will start leaning towards one way. Or you might wish to then obtain additional information from the group, but you would always use the previous round's responses to the questions to guide and then steer your research to conduct the second round. So out of the first round, and everyone's seeing it and making their responses, a second round is then conducted, and that works the same way. Distribution of a survey, analyze what the responses are, get all the responses together, and then feed that back to the whole cohort. So one of the questions that were asked, what is the single most important? I'm going to have to shift to mine because I've got the online screens. Bear with me 1 minute. So the result, what is the single most important training strategy that you believe will have the biggest impact for the future professional mariner, and why? And the results were as following. And I'm going to read them out as their bullet points, but they're quite quick. But when you think about it, a lot of it's common sense. Some of it might be, oh no, I would never do that. But generally, overall, it would look as though this is in the right direction. Training adaptation at an early stage to include future technologies. As people know about ECDIS and other technologies that are introduced, that's something that never happens, and it's always a bolt-on or something you have to learn later. So to future-proof, if you like, let's get these future technologies in the training pipeline now. Throughout career learning and use of technology to support learning. And I think we all make an assumption that we're all going to learn throughout our career, but there's no formal pattern of doing that other than those that join associations or institutes and maybe do CPD, or like myself, consider lifelong learning as part of being a professional. Fully digitizing the educational and certification process. And I know that's been a discussion for over a decade. It sounds far too sensible. It's anti-fraud as well. Why wouldn't we be doing it? We are moving towards that way now, especially even with medicals, for example. Embed complementary virtual reality and augmented reality into training. We're doing that in some respects with simulators, but we could go a lot further with that, as everybody knows. A single maritime university covering all aspects of maritime training. So that's something like the World Maritime University already is, but within the UK, that was something that was put forward. We are fragmented to coastal training providers, if you like, not always following the same curriculum, and there'll be different levels of tuition, shall we say. But one of the main things there that people recommended was that it included the wider maritime, to include offshore energy, logistics and law, for example. Implement stricter audit and inspection of training providers, specifically for cadets during their sea phase. And I think a lot of this came about with discussions during COVID-19 and how that wasn't handled quite so well, whether it was the training delivery or getting cadet berths and the junior members out on ships and actually learning. Environmental, humanitarian, technology, and holistic emphasis on the blue economy skills and training requirements. And I think that's quite an easy one to add in, because the whole world's talking about the humanitarian issues and the environment alongside any technology that may or may not be introduced. More hands-on training and mentorship. And that was something I always felt that I was really lucky to have in the Royal Navy. And I think with the Merchant Navy, it depends what ship, what line, what master you have on that vessel as to whether that is even considered, exists, or if it does, whether it's handled well. Human factors training with accredited instructors, onboard validation of skills. Yeah, it's comments along those lines about validation and having quality control and people looking or auditing. And I don't think that was just a means to somebody else to be walking around with a clipboard. I think it was more the whole discussion on how do we know how good the training is going? How can we validate across the Merchant Navy? Is it fit for purpose? Is it exceeding STCW and what the requirements are, or are we just doing the minimum? A coordinated combined education, academia, OEMs and ship management. And I think as we've now modernized now, I think everyone agrees that academia obviously plays its part, but OEMs and ship management and those that are driving the technology are all the people that we're all going to have discussions with and meet somewhere along the line. The ability for cadets to experience different shipping sectors, cargo, offshore, energy, cruise, and maybe law. And of course, for the vast majority, it's all about logistics. So that was the commentary that came back in the results of question 1. I'm going to flip to question 2 then. What single strategy would you implement if provided with the authority and the funding? And again, within my thesis, it explains why I've used the words with the authority. And of course, everything comes down to money. So in this instance, I've already said, you have the funding, what would you do? So yeah, some questions might come to me afterwards as to how this works or doesn't work, but pooling of cadet berths under the SMART scheme, approved and fully inspected companies to conduct cadet sea phase, which I think has been lacking some places, improved career enablement to the British seafarer. And that doesn't specifically mean going to British flag vessels, but I think there was a lot of commentary about those cadets that were UK that had not gone to British flag vessels and had an entirely different experience. Critical thinking and lifelong learning in a hybrid, flexible, blended method at home and when at sea. So I was pleased that sort of come up because that's me, that's what I do. That's not necessarily to say everyone's a nerd like me and enjoys doing that sort of thing, but we have to understand that as we progress through our careers as professionals, we do need to keep learning, if nothing else, just to keep pace. And as technology moves in, you don't do anything for 12 months, you're going to be left behind the curve in a lot of areas. And that's not just engines and alternative fuels, but obviously on the bridge as well, as autonomy creeps in. One of them came up saying, remove the MMTB from the UK Chamber of Shipping and place under the MCA with the Maritime Professional Council assistance. And yeah, I've had participants within my survey that were from all those branches. So some would take affront at seeing it actually spelt out like that. Others were very keen to see that happen. Of course, it is academic research and not something that's written in stone is going to happen. I failed to think my research would progress to that length. But again, it's an opinion that was out there in the maritime on the UK side. A training ship for accommodating 30 to 100 cadets for pre-sea training. And that, again, for over a decade has been a discussion. Why don't we have a training ship anymore? What could we use as a training ship?
Americans are doing that a bit.
Yeah, a lot of nations do. And, you know, whether it's a square rigger and they're teaching seamanship or ship handling, or whether it's a modern vessel or whether it's a vessel that can be used for other means, whether it be for defense, in the merchant is an offshore role maybe, or at times used for training, you know, it could be multi-purposed. More hands-on training and mentorship. So mentorship comes up again. So that's where the seniors are leading in. And there was a big discussion within it about those that could be good mentors and those that don't see themselves as one, and recognizing that fact and maybe not volunteering to be a mentor, but those that are keen to do it and wish to give back to the maritime is a good route and an avenue. But whether it be formal or informal, either way, it was talking about more hands-on training and giving the younger or the junior officers more responsibility in an early stage. Drive towards performance-based measurement of competency as opposed to time-based. And this is something that industry, even the Royal Navy at times falls short on, where they gauge everything by the amount of time done rather than the quality or what it is you've actually achieved, and does it have value. The study of incidents and accidents and a drive on lessons learned. I think the lessons learned all comes from the HSE aspect, and I'm all for that. Why keep repeating the same incidents and accidents? The MIAB will say exactly the same. There aren't any really new incidents or accidents, and it's invariably we're repeating the same thing. So a good drive on that. Connectivity wheels to sea to enable continued education and welfare provision. So I have the luxury all this year. I've been on vessels that have got Starlink. Prior to that, it was hit or miss. And it is a shame that connectivity is still an issue, but I believe as moving forward and as more vessels get fitted with the cheaper options that are still efficient and very good, like Starlink, will mean that not just for your own social use, but training at sea, and that can be conducted a lot easier. Question 3, and these questions I've put in examples. There were a lot more questions, but the time doesn't allow me to go through everything I did in my thesis. But what training will the future professional mariner require that you believe is currently not being addressed? So you might think that in some parts, some of these are being addressed, or it's in there at the moment, but the results were coming back as vastly improved leadership, change management, and resilience training. So again, I think the pandemic showed the effects of resilience, or the lack of, and how to improve people's resilience. Most seafarers that are seagoing and at sea already have that, but as the pandemic proved with extended contracts, not everyone's up for that. Leadership, that's been talked about vastly from MCA, IMO, and the Maritime Professional Council have recently put out an update to their leadership and leadership with kindness. So I'll put a plug in for them there, but they were also mentioned within my work. Periodic onboard assessments for competency, training in digital intelligence and law, which is again a way of future-proofing. The law is becoming a lot more pertinent to those physically on the vessel, not just the ship owners. And digital intelligence, I think we all would require to keep pace with that. Taking personal responsibility for training and CPD. Most would say most do that, and most professionals would, but not all. So do we take that more formally? Formal mentorship programs. So although I think, even myself as a personal opinion, I prefer the informal way, I think forcing it, pushing it, or doing a formal method does not always work so well. And I think industry itself will say the same, irrespective if it's maritime or not. Data management and cyber security skills. Enclosed space and rescue mandatory training. We have far too many deaths all the time. Whether it's more training that's required, I think the take here was that it's mandatory, that everyone should have it. So I think some of the deaths have been people that think they know but haven't done formal training. That's open for debate. But yeah, with education wise, those that aren't educated as to the risks and the dangers, making that formal or rather mandatory would be good. Improved training on maths, ICT and new fuels. That's pretty much a given as we move towards those disciplines. And improved marine engineering training to fit the reality of modern engines. Again, I made sure there was a content of participants within the survey that were not just deck officers and the engine room and the ETOs as well have made commentary, and that would be one of them. And I guess that comes down to, although we're modernising and the fleets are getting modernised, there are still older ships. So I don't think it will ever tick that box and everyone will get training on everything. But it does save some people getting pigeonholed as an engineer when they're just working on one set of machinery, when there are more modern ones and the ability to train and then you be on those modern ships. And autonomous vessel management and VTS training. And I guess that was, again, thinking of the support services like VTS that will then have to consider coming into contact with an unmanned vessel in the autonomous age as we move forward. At the very end of the questions and feedback and the analysis of it, and then re-feeding back like a closed loop system, and then coming out at the very end, Delphi methodology also asks from a form of democracy as to whether a consensus was met. So the results there was 24 yes, 3 abstained, and 6 said no. And when you think about it, and there is always a problem with academic work because you're not phoning, you're not voice or visual with anyone, that your use of the English language and how you word it, because if you simply said, do we have a consensus? Most people would then want to ask further questions. Do we have a consensus on what? What have we resolved? Do we think it's good? Do we think it's bad? So I had to make sure that I included, I think I did in the end, at least 3 examples to show what consensus I was looking at. And the consensus I was moving towards was, is the strategy correct from those with the authority, those that are instigating the training for cadets, those that are training providers and academies and universities, as well as the maritime training colleges, and are they providing the correct amount of training, and are they considering the future? So the answer to yes was actually that we can all do a lot better, that in fact we're not future proofed, that we do need to consider some of these topics that have been raised. So as I've hit the half an hour mark just after, I'm just going to close with the last couple of slides that I have here. And basically there's some bullet points about challenging strategy and leadership. So there were quite some significant people high up in the industry and the training environment that produces not only the curriculum and the training and leadership of cadets of all varieties, but also those that are master mariners and those that have the experience and those that sit on some boards, and the commission that was put together to assist Merchant Navy Training Board to consider any improvements. And I did this primarily as practitioner research. I did it as an industry collaboration because I collaborated with all those departments that are involved in the output to create new knowledge, which I believe it did. And within the dissertation, I've then given a précis of those areas where new knowledge was gained. For those that were participating, it was a reminder, I think, on industry accountability, and those that do have a very significant role to play in steering how the strategy goes, and that we don't get left behind, and that we do think about the future, and that we, before the future arrives, build into our systems that flexibility and resilience to be able to train to that level. Of course, it was broadening horizons because I didn't just emphasize a deck cadet. I worked around the different disciplines and worked into offshore and noted things like cruise liners as well, and not least ferries, because unfortunately P&O sacked 800 of our fellow seafarers halfway through my research, which was very topical and great for a couple of paragraphs in my research, but goddamn awful for the seafarers involved. So topical, yes, I wish it never happened, but that led me onto a wake-up call. And it is a wake-up call that if we don't modernize, if we don't work our structures and train our people, and in the wider environment, how our ships of various flags now or open registries treat our seafarers, then we do need to consider that. I consider it a personal challenge because I never came through the cadet route in the Merchant Navy. And participants, obviously, with being anonymous. This is a redacted one, but this was the sheet that I used. The 3 red lines denote those that were approached that were unable to participate for one reason or another. The other 32, their contact details and names are all removed. I can't see with my glasses, so I'm just bringing it up on my laptop. So yeah, not only from the Nautical Institute and academia, there was Harbour Masters, a variety of different maritime schools, MPC UK, NMI, Kinetic, Maritime UK, some masters, IMEC, those involved with Lloyd's, Marlins, unions, Nautilus, also the MCA, MNTB, and Trinity House, etc. So I'd like to think that the 2 years it took me prior to starting this to softening up some of these people that were in quite substantial positions to discuss this matter. Like I said, it's a team effort, and you can't do it without these voluntary participants. So it was fantastic that they did. To top it all off, I did 6 interviews afterwards. They were videoed and recorded with their permission, but it was only allowed to go to the supervisor, who then, in a formal process at academia, could see the questioning that I'd actually conducted that, and that a small part of my results was based on the 6 interviews that I had. So they were the MCA and MTB. They were both members of the Maritime Skills Commission, which I mentioned. Also, the Maritime Professional Council, there was 2 persons, one of them being Honourable Company of Master Mariners as well, trade unions body, and a maritime training centre. And that was very beneficial, and I liked that I could do that at the park, because after all the surveys, all the questions, all the analysis, everyone seeing else's questions, it was nice to be able to pick those particular bodies, which was a cross section. To gain their views on completion of the study. And academic research, my why. I think I broached it just to finish off here now at the very beginning, that I'm part of a generation that I think of professionals that are doing CPD, considering lifelong learning. I also mentioned that I don't want to see anyone's hard work end up in a dusty volume in a library somewhere and never looked at. So I did it because I wanted to give back to the community. So I'll open the room out to any questions. I hope it's been informative. Academic research can be a bit dry sometimes. But what I will say, and I don't think it's through any point of my direct research, because although I shared it with all these participants afterwards, a lot of the effort had already gone into, shall we say, a participatory way of thinking about what the future would be for maritime training. And in fact, the MCA then last year started a whole host of questionnaires that were provided for everyone to respond to. And that was one of the major things that came up in my research. And I think asking those questions and highlighting them, and then, as you saw in one of the bullet points there, some form of accountability. So one of the outcomes was that we shouldn't be thinking in silos. There is a wealth of information, experience, the mariners out there should be required for training for the future. And I think a lot of them got neglected or felt that they didn't have a voice. In part, I think I saw that where the Maritime Professional Council was then formed. That was formed just as I started my research. And that was one effort that was put together to try and provide a voice higher up, so that the strategy for training could be changed, or at least they would have a voice as to what that would be. And a lot of the arguments were, I think, historically centered around ECDIS and how that didn't go well, and also simulation and how simulators are going to be used. Again, that's for deck officers, but obviously engineers as well. So simulators are coming in for engineering plant and to use, so why shouldn't they?
I think AI, according to the adverts on the television for engineers, that's where we learn it.
I wonder if I could make a couple of observations, if I may. Thank you very much for that. I found that very interesting. And I speak not from my former naval persona, but as a member of the Honourable Company of Master Mariners, where I've been involved for almost 30 years now, half of that time as chairman of the membership committee and also chairman of the professional and technical committee for quite a while. Lots of the themes that you brought out there are reported to us almost routinely by the almost 300 apprentices and associate members that we've got. And an example recently was that there were something like 60 odd cadets who had done their shore training, but couldn't get enough sea time to get their off the watch certificates. And these cadets had gone through the formal training, in many cases not subsidized by anyone, and then were just sort of thrown out onto the market to try and find billets to get their sea time. And I was able, at a period when, fortunately, as a result of COVID, the Royal Navy had a number of spare training billets, and we managed to get the best part of 60 of these young officers through training at HMS Collingwood, and then to sea to complete their 12 months of sea time, as agreed by the MCA, who said they would accept that as sea time qualification with these officers. That's unlikely to happen again, given the way the Navy is moving. But that problem is still there, and I'm not surprised that you get some of the responses that you do, given that background for not really seeing through the training of officers once they've completed the shore phase. The other comment I would make, you mentioned about training about enclosed spaces. I found it very interesting over the years to look at the yellow pages in the Seaways magazine. There's hardly a month goes by when there's not yet another incident of someone going into an enclosed space and dying. And many of these people are quite senior. There was one a while ago where it was the chief officer who went into an enclosed space on his own without telling anyone else that he'd done so. And I wrote an article for Seaways on that subject, and it was all about the difference between lessons learned and lessons identified. The real problem is that with each of those incidents, it almost always says, the lessons learned from this were as follows. Well, they clearly haven't been actioned, otherwise it wouldn't keep happening. And my recommendation there was we need to push the responsibility for that up to the top of the tree in these organizations. And in my time in industry with the Babcock International Group, we had a pretty poor safety record in some of the areas we were operating. And in order to make sure that things happen properly, we shifted it up, the responsibility, to the boards of those individual companies. And you might say that could be a shipping company, for example, and made them responsible for safety. And we found very quickly that the number of near miss reports we got was tenfold after we started docking people's bonuses because of accidents in their company. Those were the two observations. But the most important one of that is we need to look much more carefully at the way young officers, both deck officers and engineers, are handled through their careers, because at the moment it's haphazard.
Couldn't agree more with you on both those counts. And one of the driving forces for my research was with the experience of the Royal Navy and how I was treated. And I had a sea dad, and I had a training pipeline, and other people kept an eye on it. And I went through all the different phases and learned and gained responsibility at each stage. That I serve on merchant Navy ships now, where I don't see that. They're sort of thrown in at the deep end. There's nobody to mentor them. They're left to their own devices. Because they're junior or not qualified, they don't actually get to do anything other than just maybe witness it now and again. It's not like a task book like a submariner would understand it. It's just a little book that gets ticked in some places. And unfortunately, there's a record of these boxes getting ticked without the cadet having actually experienced or undertaken that task or that project, which is unfortunate again. But I think if the pros and cons, I think the fact that we have Smart Sea and it's sort of a tax benefit for the shipping companies, at least it's a way with the smaller UK flag merchant fleet to get the boys and girls onto vessels. It is better than some other countries, which they just have maritime colleges that are kind of a conveyor belt that spit out hundreds and hundreds a year, none of which are going to ever see a vessel, no doubt. And unfortunately, the Philippines, Nigeria, and places like that, and India are just turning out cadets, and they have nowhere to go afterwards. So there are pros and cons. So I don't look at it always on the downside. Sometimes there's some good side.
I would just make a comment there that you're comparing the Royal Navy with, in fact, the Merchant Navy. There are two, in fact, very different organisations. One is a very clear, structured organisation, that's the Royal Navy, with, in fact, development of individuals which can be assessed at all stages, right to the top, as no doubt Nigel isn't I will, in fact, be aware. The Merchant Navy, of course, is very, very different. It's a group. I sometimes dislike the word Navy. It's the mercantile marine. It's a sort of a mixture of many different organisations, each with their own sort of separate type of strategies to survive in a profit sort of related world. And it's not surprising that we get difficulties. I was sort of trained with Alfred Holt Company, Blue Funnel Line at Liverpool, and it made its name, in fact, on having well-trained officers. To such an extent that in certain periods of time before I started my training, they would not insure their ships except with the personnel they actually employed. And that's quite an interesting concept. That in fact, if shore shipping companies now were told that you can't insure your ships, but you can only do it through, in fact, your personnel, maybe we might have a higher standard of, in fact, training and facilitation of our sort of our future officers. Just a few thoughts.
Yeah, just comments from my part. In the Merchant Navy, standards vary quite considerably from one company to another. I've noticed from my own experience, and ship types tend to be different as well. Tankers, for instance, are very hot on safety.
And some of the comments were depends on the master or the chief officer or the chief engineer as well. So, but yeah, we're not all robots, and we don't all.
A more complex world, hasn't it?
Yeah.
From our early days, we were in fact working for a shipping company, Alfred Holt, which was essentially a British shipping company based in Liverpool. So the whole operation was there, including in fact training. Today it is much more international, with a whole variety of different sort of organisations and different people. In fact,
and a lot of those points that were coming up on your first Delphi question, I look back and I thought, we're doing that. And all right, I've lost my hair and it's gone white. But at those days, yes, we had a cadetship. I sailed on cadetships. We were mentored properly. We had lots of hands-on training at all the levels. Lucky perhaps. As I progressed through my career, one of the things I did, I ran a suite of simulators, ship's bridge simulators. And we had ship's bridge teams from a massive variety of companies and nationalities all over the world. And it was very interesting to see the differences we got of those who they were. And as you say, a lot of it, because the bridge teams normally we would ask for to come for the week's training was a master, a mate, second mate, third mate, a bridge team. We didn't want 4 masters, we didn't want 4 third mates. It didn't work like that. And what was interesting was the variance amongst those officers, perhaps as you'd expect, of the masters particularly, because they're the ones who are leading. But how some of them were extremely good. And there were 1 or 2 who were absolutely terrible and dangerous. In fact, I actually got one, it doesn't matter, one was so dangerous that I had to talk to the company about it, and it was clearly a problem. And they just wouldn't grasp the nettle. They knew, wouldn't grasp the nettle that master they were put on a very big tankers, VLCCs, was actually Shouldn't have been anywhere near a ship.
So I think mainly the research which was pointing, and because it was based around the strategy of where we go, and it was future looking, was the case of not stagnating, not accepting everything you see as the norm, not we've always done it this way, let's carry on. It was driving under the banner sort of accountability of you guys, you've got to be thinking about these things, because it's no good trying to introduce something today because it'll always be out of date already. And it, not necessarily looking at the next 5 years, but the next 10 years. So things like styling, alternative fuels, and what we're doing with regards to autonomy, they've got to be on the ball with it. That's got to be part of the curriculum now. They've got to raise the bar well above STCW and say this is what the guys and girls need to learn out there. And my research covered a lot of other topics as well, which I didn't have time to discuss here, but I mentioned girls as well. So I did quite a bit on equity within all genders and working through all the different ranks and opportunities for career progression and that, but also the diversity and how modern ships and that can then, or should be already, accommodating that.
The other trouble is, like Paul makes, is that I agree with Paul. I don't like the term merchant navy. I know where it comes from, and it doesn't really reflect the reality of what we are. There are lots of companies. It depends on the company that you work for, and so many of those companies are driven, as you say, by that bottom line. They have to be. They're commercial entities. They're not there for any other reason but to make money for their shareholders, and they actually haven't got. A lot of them haven't got an interest in anything. They have no idea who their masters are. A lot of the times I was charging ships at one time, and you talk to the owner, but he had no idea. And when you went to see the ships, there was no communication between the owner of the ships and the master. They'd never met. In fact, one owner was a telephone line and a laundry in Hong Kong. That's how you got hold of him. And he had no sense of responsibility for his company or anything like that, apart from the fact that he had money coming in. And we saw a lot of that. And yet at the other end of the spectrum, you find companies who led from the top. They took that responsibility, and they were some classics. But the ones I saw really were the big oil companies, where a vice president of the oil company, one of the really big names we all know, came, and they would send their VPs, their American VPs, not just shipping, but of the oil company, to the British team management and visit us and stay with us for a few weeks or for a few days during the week to ensure that the masters and all the junior officers, third mates, this guy was God. Nigel, it would be like having junior officers in the course, and there'd be a full admiral, 3-star admiral, being there, watching, taking part in everything else, and trying to ensure that those people understood that he up there wanted this to happen, because there was a big bit of misinformation. The top of the company wanted things to be safe, wanted things to happen. The guys at the bottom, you guys, young guys, knew about safety, understood that you were a coalface, that it mattered. But there'd be middle management in between who were stuck in a sandwich of being chased to make profitability, but being required to look after other issues, and they found it difficult to merge the two. Lack of training, lack of understanding, lack of whatever. But time and time again, we saw those problems.
I think what we're discussing there is professionalism and leadership, and it varies significantly. So, like you've said there, certain aspects or certain disciplines or trades within the Merchant Navy considered it a higher value and did something about it and made sure that all their teams knew. We talk in modern ways now of what the company culture is, or there's going to be a safety culture, or this is our mission. It's all part of that, but without the leadership at the top that's going to drive it, it's just lip service, or like the greenwashing or a tick box exercise.
Very often it's an accident that causes the senior management to change their tune, and in that case,
I would help think of the Herald of Free Enterprise, which was in fact a hallmark case, which did in fact change the culture to some extent on many shipping companies. where in fact now the managing mind is actually the responsible persons. And if you remember, in fact, the managing mind of P&O Ferries was very nearly charged with corporate manslaughter. And it's sometimes, it sounds sad, but perhaps that should have been followed through, which would then have really shaken up the shipping companies to recognise the full responsibility at the very top. And then that would have, and I think it did cascade down anyway, but probably with a little bit more.
The Valdez did it for the oil companies. SO was the only company in existence that could stand the loss that incurred because of Valdez. Any of the other oil companies, Chevrons, Phillips, all the rest of them, would have gone out of business with the Valdez. That shook them completely because they knew they had a problem.
But again, it's unfortunate in the maritime, especially and offshore as well. For instance, Piper Alpha, that it is one of those dramatic losses and the loss of life that actually makes some of the boardroom sit up in their chairs.
My experience with cruise ships was talking to officers that had been on cruise ships for 10, 15, 20, 30 years was they said before Costa Concordia, everything was completely different. I think the phrase that they used to describe was a love boat, where there was absolutely no regulation there was no oversight by companies. You'd set on captain of his own master. It's how come the captain of a cruise ship could think, I'm going to show off to my missus on the bridge and drive 200 metres offshore.
That shouldn't have happened, should it?
Yes.
Of course, under the ISM.
And
the responsibilities which came through that sort of system.
But it becomes a norm. That's
as soon
didn't it?
as it happened with
I'll
cruises.
give you another example of how bad it could be, and it's a major passenger liner cruise company. I went out to do a bridge audit on their ship, their fleet, which had been having accidents, and they shut me out because they were going to be refused insurance. So I flew out and I phoned up the marine superintendent and said, "Are you coming out with me?" Because I'd seen that in the oil company where I've done bridge audits, and a marine superintendent would often come out and take the opportunity to be there. Oh no, the marine superintendent didn't have a budget to travel. And this was a worldwide operating, one of the major cruise companies. You may work for them, I don't know. And yeah, he didn't have a budget to travel. He said, "I'd love to come out with you. I haven't been on any of our ships unless they come into the UK. I can't get on."
There you go.
Absolutely crazy.
Well, it shows how sometimes fragmented it can be, and as good as the offshore industry thinks it is, since Piper Alpha and that remodernised permit to work, appointed persons, and safe systems of work, but the BP Macondo Horizon showed that it only takes a little bit of complacency and it can go horribly and terribly wrong again.
The way the reputational damage as well.
Yeah. So to end this on a good note, because we have hit the hour mark now, I just say thank you for everyone for joining in this what was originally a joint IMRS RENA and Nautical Institute presentation. Thank you for putting up with my presentation as a standby. If you're not a member of the Nautical Institute, please consider joining us. Always put that bit in. And yeah, thank you for everyone for participating and discussions afterwards. Cheers, Richard. Thank you, Nigel.